And with that, we are live. It's me, Robert Phoenix, coming at you from the Hill Country, Kerrville, Texas. And it is a Friday. And on Friday, we have the Friday FARcast, which is me most of the time interviewing people, which I really enjoy doing. And yesterday, this is how dedicated James is. James Bartley, who is our esteemed guest today, got up at 5:15 in the morning to do this because he's got a kid, and in order for him to, he lives in Australia, so there's a bit of a time gap there, right? So in order for him to get up and get his kid ready for his day, he's got to get up extra early in order to get the work in. So thanks to James for making the effort to rise and shine. And not only, it's not always easy to do this. Um, it's even harder to do it when you're doing it at 5:15 in the morning. So tip of the cap to James there as well, because he comes out guns blazing. What he has a website called the Cosmic Switchboard, and I did an interview with him, I think last week. I don't know when it's going to pop on his site, but that's what sparked him being a guest on the show. James has been a guest on this show before, and I've been a guest on the Cosmic Switchboard as well. I think at least once, maybe twice. I think this might have been my third time with him. And the interesting thing about James, whom I really dig, I really like James a lot, is that we actually grew up in the same neighborhood and didn't know it. So we've got about a 4-year difference between us. So I think I might have been graduating and he might have been in the 8th grade. I might have been a senior and he might have been in the 8th grade or a freshman. He lived maybe about a mile away from me in San Jose. And that comes up during the interview because we talk about the San Jose East Bay foothills during part of the interview, which I lived right up against those foothills um, for my quote unquote formative years. And those hills were, I mean, they weren't insignificant. They're pretty good size. In fact, I think it's the third, might be the fourth largest peak in the Bay Area is not far from there, where they have the James Lick Observatory in Alum Rock Park. So it's pretty high. Um, but there was just something about those hills that was, to me, mysterious, and even at times like dark. Like they had these hills had kind of a dark energy. Uh, and interestingly enough, it comes up in the interview with James. He's the one that brings it up, and he talks about the things that were going on in those hills out of San Jose. So, what would you call that? The foothills, the East San Jose foothills. And I used to spend a lot of time, like climbing around those hills and shit like that as a kid. There was a park. I think it was a state park or county park. I forget which. Kind of towards more Milpitas, but up in the hills. We go up there and rent horses, and we'd go ride horses around these hills. It was in that regard, it was a pretty good place to grow up. But I don't want to get too into the biographical details here, and let's just get going. The interview is about an hour and 40 minutes, and there's just so much information and density. And wherever you are on the whole alien or ET thing, and I know some people are like, well, they don't exist, they're not real. There's a big broad spectrum, right? They don't exist, they're not real, they're interdimensional, they've been here for a long time. They're a government program, they are real, and then these are the various, species or manifestations of who and what they are, what they look like, and what their trip is, right? You got a big, broad spectrum of belief and non-belief in there. So, just for an hour and 40 minutes, I ask you to suspend your belief or disbelief and just listen to what James has to say. And I throw a few things out there, and it's not like I'm, playing 60 minutes with him and giving hardline questioning. I really just wanted him to unpack as much as he could, given the amount of time that we had, and he did not disappoint. All right, so without any more delay, let's play this bad boy here. This is James Bartley and myself from yesterday, and we're going down the rabbit hole. Challenging issue here with the video. Oh, so this is a long video. We got a frozen site too. That's not fun. All right, got to reload here. Don't go away. All right, we're back. So let me try and reload the video, because Google decided to freeze up, which of course it has been known to do from time to time. And it's really funny, like when I was recording this with James, that wasn't happening. Did not happen. We went an entire basically stream recording without any challenges or issues. All right, here we go.
I am absolutely thrilled to have my pal James Bartley from the Cosmic Switchboard back on the Friday FARcast. I think it's been 3 or 4 years maybe since you were on this show. And I always enjoy talking with you, whether I'm a guest on your show or you're a guest on my show. And recently I was on your show and we had a great chat. And then you had agreed to come back on here. And one of the things that I wanted to do, and we brought this up when we spoke, was to really get into the extraterrestrial, close encounter, abduction, contact world. Because that is, you can go in so many directions, but really this is your expertise. This is your field of study, your life work. And we don't often go down this avenue of thought, research, conversation, but I felt like it's time. And if there was anybody that I'd have the conversation with, it'd be you, because of what you know and how long you've been doing this. And just a bit of personal background. There was a time in my life where I was very into UFOs, growing up in the 60s and the 70s, and, the Bermuda Triangle and Eric Von Daniken and Chariots of the Gods. And then later on, I was never a big, Spielberg guy, but man, when that TV series, The Intruders, was on, that really grabbed my attention. And so that was, I was in the whole kind of UFO world and lore. I found it fascinating. I've actually seen unidentified craft. May have even had some kind of odd experience of missing time, which maybe we could talk about later. And so it's not like this is something I'm not familiar with. It's an area that had a great deal of interest for me. And then at a certain point in time, I just decided I'm not going to go down that field of research anymore. There were other people who were far more studied in the field than I was. And I didn't want to just be a casual observer because in this world, James, you can attest that you need to know your shit, right? Because people will call you out on it, they'll question you. And then if you don't really have any historical context, timeline stuff, you get caught with your pants down. And it's like, oh, it's another whack job, right? So I couldn't commit that amount of time to going down that path. But we get that time today. So thanks for being here. And let's get into it. When did you get grabbed by this idea and life work of UFOs, extraterrestrials, contact, this whole thing?
Myself, I was always interested in it. When I was a boy, I was deeply fascinated in Greek mythology. And there was something about the stories which had a resonance with me. I didn't, even as a boy, I didn't regard stories from Greek mythology as being fantastical or impossible. To me, I sensed some level of truth there. So I was kind of predisposed to this, if you will. And then I was also into other dimensions, the Bermuda Triangle, Bigfoot, anything of a paranormal, unusual nature. And then, as you know, growing up, your focus changes. Bike riding, hanging out with friends, rock and roll, baseball games. And over the years, intermittently, these odd events would happen to me, which I now know is missing time, nosebleeds, a whole series of UFO-related dreams, and a whole series of UFO sightings, some of them quite close. Never made a connection that somehow I was involved with that, right? To me, oh, it's another UFO sighting, and I'd hear stories, what have you. I was always a reader, and I've always been a student of military history, and this factors into it too, because later, when I found out of the deep, covert involvement of the military-industrial complex, things started to click into place for me. So fast forward to 1988, which my mentor, Barbara Bartley, who later became one of her close confidants, she told me that 1988 she regarded as the UFO invasion year because she was working the tri-states area of Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas, mostly, but all around the country. But that's where she's from, was from, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So she'd worked with and regressed a number of people that had been taken individually or also in group abductions. And she told me that there were times the ETs were coming down and taking up whole families, and indeed, like several families in a certain neighborhood, in Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. So years later, when I told her I started having all these experiences in '88, she was really interested when I told her, and I had a number of experiences where I felt like I was being pulled upwards. Like imagine facing down and your arms and legs dangling beneath you, and it felt as if a giant magnet or a giant vacuum cleaner was sucking me upwards, right? And so I had a number of dreams where I was being pulled upwards, and on two occasions, the first happened in probably the early '80s, and then the next happened around '88, '89 timeframe. I actually woke up and found myself with my back against the ceiling and the white bed sheets draping down, right? And gravity pulling down the bed sheets. And that's all I remember from that particular experience. The problem was I didn't have any kind of a context in which to understand all this, right? And then I'd come back from a summer language study program in Germany. I was in the lowest part of Germany, the Black Forest, south of Freiburg, right across the river from Switzerland on the Rhine River. Black Forest there. And right before I was due to come back home, about 2 weeks from coming back to California, San Jose, California, I started getting this creepy crawly feeling of, you know, being watched, of feeling presences. And I kind of reverted to my behavior, uh, you know, in the past where I began to sleep with the lights on again. And there's a stretch of uh, sidewalk on the German side of the Rhine River there, where the forest is so thick, they've actually managed to create a tunnel out of the foliage. And this stretched for about like 90, 100 feet, right? And at night, when I had to go through there, and this is like the last 2 weeks that I was there, I was starting to get this creepy feeling again of being watched, of being monitored. I was so fearful, Robert. I would sprint through that foliage tunnel. I mean, just put my head down, Ricky Henderson, just run as if I'm going to steal second base, right? And that went on for a couple of weeks. Flew back to San Jose, California, San Francisco, and then I lived in San Jose. And then in a matter of just a few weeks, I had a series of close UFO encounters, a gray ET looking out of my TV at me, and full-blown alien abduction where I woke up and there were 3 reptilian grays. These weren't just the standard ubiquitous grays you always hear about. These had clawed appendages. They weren't fingers with a long nail. They were just claws. What the late, great Dr. Carla Turner, a friend of mine, referred to as chicken claws. And these were reptilian grays. They seemed to be some kind of a hybrid variant between the reptilians and the grays. And they had the big black eyepieces behind which probably would have been those vertical pupils. So I wake up and there they are, right? And then
Okay, so all right, I got to pump the brakes on you for a minute. How old are you? It's around 88,
this would have
89?
been 1990. I was born 64, 74, 84, 26 years old.
26 years
So,
old.
yeah. And I do believe that most people who come to an awareness of alien abductions in their life, they have a certain like inbuilt alarm clock, which at some point it goes off, right? And then it compels you, well, it compels some people to do a life inventory to figure out what the hell is going on, right?
Yeah.
So I woke up, and there was the 3 entities there. My room was dark. I left the lights off, and for a change, but I can still see them quite clearly. It's like they brought their own ambient light with them. It's hard to explain. And then things happened to be there in my room, which I won't get into. And then they took me up into the ship, and things really unraveled from there. So the next morning, I woke up. I was a basket case, as you can imagine. But the fear compelled me to read everything I could about the subject. Now, it's interesting that you got the uh, Betty and Barney Hill photo behind you, because when that movie came out, I remember it terrified me. The scene where the ET sticks his head into the window and Barney's freaking out. I couldn't even watch the whole movie. And later on, still, this was in the early 80s when I was going to high school, and I'd had a number of experiences, missing time, light beams coming in through my bedroom, through the ceiling, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of out-of-body experiences, which I've since come to understand. And some of those cases were induced by the ETs themselves, some object lesson to show that I wasn't all just flesh and blood, whatever the case may be. So around that time frame in high school, I was even frightened of Mork and Mindy. I didn't even want to watch that because of the UFO angle. And as much as I love the band UFO, right? Michael Schenker, Phil Mogg, all those guys, there was something I just didn't like the name of the band,
I
right?
loved
So
UFO, man. They were
yeah,
great.
yeah, they were great. The Paul
Yeah.
Chapman era too is
Yeah.
always forgotten, but that was a great band. And but just the name just kind of turned me off, right?
Yeah.
So fast forward to 1990, I just have a series of experiences and culminating in that full-blown alien abduction. So what I did was I started reading everything I could. I would drive 45 minutes to East Ridge Mall in East Side San Jose.
Mhm.
And there was an old B. Dalton's bookstore there. It's probably now a defunct chain. And I cleaned them out systematically, right?
Yeah.
All the books.
Yeah.
And the one book that I saved for the last during that period, and we talked about this before we came on, was Communion by Whitley Strieber. For some reason, and I've heard the same thing from other alien abductees, whenever I came across that book cover, I would just avert my eyes and just not even look at it. And for a while, when that book first came out, they would plop this big display, the communion book cover, in front of these bookstores. And so I would just walk by and avert my eyes, and it's like, not even looking at this, right?
It was
So
a huge seller.
it was a huge seller. And I think a lot of it had to do with the book cover, if you ask me.
Yeah.
And so I held off on communion because I'd had this innate irrational fear about it for so long, but it was the last book about alien abductions in B. Dalton's. So I had to buy it, right? So I read it, and then I got the sequel to that, Transformations, I think was the book after that.
Yeah.
And then, and this was a pivotal point in my life, moved from San Jose, which at the time, I don't know about now, but at the time was I considered a backwater UFO research, despite all the activity going on there. The East Foothills, I'm convinced there's some kind of deep black military
Well, you and I
base there.
both know we both lived there.
Yeah.
Right. I grew up there, and you grew up. We grew up in the same area. I think it was the 17 line bus that I would take to East Ridge Mall when I was a kid. We'd hang out at that.
That's the same. I took that bus sometimes too. Yeah, I knew exactly where the buses were. Where they all formed up.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That was my old stomping grounds. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'd read all the books I could find. Communion was the last book in the series, and then before I went to San Diego, when I was still in San Jose, and this is where the military connection part comes in, right? I walk into, went through a number of name changes, Lucky's, grocery stores, and then I became, some other name.
Yeah.
And I walk into the bookstore, right? I go into the sliding doors, make a left, head straight to the book section, and there, right at eye line level, almost like it was waiting for me, was the book by Randall and Schmidt, UFO Crash at Roswell. Well, this is interesting, I thought. So I grabbed it and I read it. I bought it and read it, and then things began to fall in place. But because for me, the mental adjustment into, okay, first I had to come to grips with me having these experiences, right? Which was ominous enough. Why the hell would they be interested in me, for one thing? Secondly, when I saw that reading that book, UFO Crash at Roswell, since then Kevin Randall is morphed into a UFO debunker, turning into a psychologist, right? To kind of explain away people like me, will write us off as some kind of mental aberration. But Donald Schmidt is continuing the work, and I've had Donald Schmidt on my show in the recent past. And so I devoured that book cover to cover, and things started to fall in place. Okay, what they're describing here, the covert, it wasn't really so covert, crash retrieval of an alien spacecraft in the New Mexico desert, there's a high degree of plausibility to it. When I read the story and then read the number of flights leaving Walker Field, Roswell, to places like Carswell Field in Fort Worth, Wright Pat, what became Wright Pat in Dayton, Ohio, because I'm so familiar with reading military history, logistics, infrastructure, what have you, and having come from a Navy brat family. I was a Navy brat. My dad did 2 tours in Vietnam. Things started to click in place for me. So they know more than just about the sightings. There's more than just the pilot report. They've actually got their hands on the hardware, right? And that's a key point to make. So I read that book, and wow, that was an awakening for me. Moved to San Diego in the early 90s, leaving what I considered a UFO backwater, despite all the activity and all the experiences I had in San Jose.
Can I stop you there for just 1 second?
Please. Yeah, please.
Those hills on the east side of San Jose always struck me as being very dark. There was a dark energy in those hills.
Absolutely.
And I lived right up against them. And I was both fascinated and kind of terrified by those hills.
Well, you might have moved on by then, but while I was still in San Jose, I noticed a lot of military activity, twin rotor Chinook helos, hordes of them flying towards the East Foothills.
Right.
I talked to Ruben Uriarte, another San Jose researcher from MUFON, and he knew about what was going on there too. So it's not just the East Foothills, the South Bay, like the Cupertino, Almaden, area. There's a lot of mysterious underground base activity. The locals kept hearing booms and explosions underground, sounds of machinery, what have you. And then the northern part of the South Bay, that's where you have NASA Ames at what used to be NAS Moffett Field. You
Lockheed was
have
there.
Lockheed, the Missile and Space Division,
Yep.
very spooky place. The Blue Cube, which is a NSA NRO tracking facility. And then beneath that, what used to be nothing but orchards in San Jose, Santa Clara, that's where Silicon Valley popped up, right? And I used to work in the semiconductor industry. So anyway, yes, that whole area was creepy, but I couldn't get any traction trying to interact with other researchers there. They were always so territorial and possessive. What do you want to talk to my abductees for? They're my abductees. I just want to network with them, compare notes. I mean, I've had experiences too. That was my plea, but it fell on deaf ears, right? So eventually I moved to San Diego, and that's where I met, after about a year being there, Sean Atlanty, who was the founder of the San Diego UFO Society, and that opened me up to a whole new vista. Because in contrast to San Jose, the networking in Southern California was well developed. I mean, Sean had contacts and was friends with some of the biggest named, highly regarded UFOs researchers around the world, not just in California. So immediately I was plugged into that network, and through that I met other alien abductees, and eventually met Eve Lorgan, a close colleague of mine. And in this process, I got introduced to Barbara Bartley, who became my mentor. She was based out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, until she was assassinated. It's a whole nother story. So it was my tutelage under Barbara, because I knew once I got heavy into the research, and like all real researchers, I go where the evidence leads me. One has to use some degree of discernment. One has to have, filters on, because someone could be relating to you an absolutely real story, but because of all these experiences, all the trauma, what have you, some may regard them as somewhat non-credible. Maybe they've got substance abuse issues, whatever the case may be, but the core story, the core element of what they're trying to relate, there's validity to it. So I'm not going to throw the baby out of the bathwater, because someone's had a few slip-ups in their life. But sometimes if they start confabulating too much and the story changes, well, then you got to kind of make your own mental adjustment. That's just an example, but the people I network with tended to be very, sober, highly credible, earnest people who wanted to share their stories. And for the first time in San Diego, I met people and took part in alien abduction support group meetings, what have you. And so eventually I was a member in good standing of the San Diego UFO Society. I began to conduct my own investigations, me and Eve Lorgan, when we finally teamed up. And then through a series of serendipitous events, I got to know Barbara Bartley, and she became my mentor, and she became my spiritual mama, essentially. Because in my Southern California researchers investigation, and especially the high desert of Southern California, I became aware of a lot of reptilian and military abduction cases. And before too long, I began having military abduction cases myself, what we call my lab experiences. And then in San Diego, and I'll just, relate the story and then pause and let you, ask me a question. I did a life inventory. I took the yellow legal pads, yay big, and I sat down at a table one Saturday morning in San Diego, and I wrote out every single strange anomaly I can remember going back to childhood. And after literally several pages, I realized this thing, whatever it is, and by now I'd read all those abduction books from San Jose. This thing, whatever it is, I've been a part of it all this time. And the turning point also in San Diego was I read Dr. Kenneth Ring's book, UFOs, NDEs, and the Mind at Large. And at the end of that book, there was a questionnaire to determine if someone had had alien abduction experiences. Many abduction researchers send these questionnaires out, types of questionnaires. Now, a little background. I just had a few days before what I considered to be an unsuccessful hypnotic regression. My friend Sean Atlanty, director of San Diego UFO Society, put me under. Nothing new came out of my missing time abduction experiences from 1990, just a couple of years before. So I thought, oh, crestfallen, nothing new has come up. What I didn't realize at the time was that regression where really was under. Now, Barbara told me years later that I'm one of those people that are going to be hard to regress because there's so many things programmed into me that, prevent me at some level from accessing more memories. And Barbara told me this, but this is before I met Barbara. And Sean did this regression on me. I thought it was a failure, but it kind of stirred things around in my subconscious. So I'm reading this questionnaire in the back of Kenneth Ring's book. And then I get to this question that says, as a young boy, did you ever, or a young child, did you ever see or experience little friends that no one else could see? And the moment I read that question, it's like a zip file opened in my subconscious. And out of that came this daylight experience when I was 4 or 5 years old in Corpus Christi, Texas. My dad at the time was stationed at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. And I remember it clearly because it had to be the autumn or the winter because my mom was ironing my dad's seaman's uniform. It was the dark navy blue uniform. So that tells me it would have been autumn or winter. And he was ironing my dad's clothes, and then I was in my room playing by myself. I remember this distinctly. It was dusk. We had these Venetian blinds that were open lightly. The slats were slightly open. The waning, rays of the sun were streaming in, and I could see the dust motes uh, floating right there by the window. And just then, I felt the presence. I turned around, and there was a small being. It wasn't a gray. It was about 3 feet high, tall, and it was floating. And if you ever read Katarina Wilson's book, The Alien Jigsaw Researcher Supplement, her second book, she has a sketch and describes a being in there. She calls it type 2 gray. Now, what I saw wasn't gray, but otherwise, the description that Katarina Wilson gave pretty much matched what I saw. It didn't have an overly large head. It was brown and a kind of mottled kind of skin surface. It wasn't smooth, round eyes, but not overly large, and a slit for a mouth. And being a little kid, my reaction was, what are you doing here? This is my room. These are my toys. Get out of here. Right. That was my attitude. And then it came back to me with a telepathic message. I've since come to understand that countless other people have heard similar messages, okay, about how I'm special and I got some destiny fulfilled in the future and some unnamed, unspecified destiny. And I wasn't interested in any of that. What are you doing in my room? So I said, I'm going to tell my mom on you. And then it came back and said, go ahead. She won't see me anyway. So I went out to the living room where my mom was ironing and I tried to encourage her to come back with me to the bedroom to look at this being. And, she's busy ironing. And finally, I literally grabbed her by the elbow, hauled her over to my bedroom, flung the door open. I said, see, look. Of course, it was no longer there. My mom storms off, right? I go into the room, close the door behind me, and then the being manifests again and looks at me almost with the I told you so expression, right? So all that came out as I read that question in Kenneth Ring's book. And because of what I thought was a failed regression of just a few days before, the whole thing opened in my mind like a zip file. So then I realized, okay, I've had this all my life. And then when I started studying the MILAB military abduction medical experimentation angle, I realized that when I was young, see, my dad was a enlisted man, right?
Right.
In the Uniform Code of Military Justice and in military hospital systems, oftentimes the doctors are very high-ranking personnel. Like in the Navy scheme of things, commanders, lieutenant commanders, captains. Captain would be a colonel in the Air Force or the Army. So when my dad got his orders because I'm not going to go into it, but I had some childhood issues health-wise, right? Which I think now were somewhat induced in order to plug me into this system. So my dad and my mom being concerned parents and my dad being in the Navy, when you get told, bring your son to this medical clinic or this medical clinic, it's aye, sir. Yes, there's no question about that. So I was taken to places, but I found out later were notorious mind control centers, Naval Medical Center, Balboa Park in San Diego, I was taken to. Oak Knoll Naval Hospital in the Bay Area, I was taken to.
Mhm.
I used to have missing time because they told my mom to give me these pills prior to the car ride, I guess, to keep me from getting car sick or whatever, but they knocked me out. So there was a lot of time. My dad was a painfully slow driver anyway. So, I mean, there were times I'd wake up in the middle bench seat of the station wagon we were in, and like I would just be drugged out. And I'd look over at times and see my younger brother next to me, similarly drugged out, right? So we'd be taken to Oak Knoll. Uh, I was taken to the Presidio in Army Letterman General Hospital there in San
Mhm.
Francisco. Had a
Right.
missing time experience there, and at Oak Knoll, I think I woke up in a medical clinic with all these wires strapped to my head, et cetera, et cetera. So when I started delving into the MyLab aspect to it, I realized, crikey, you know, I'd gone through similar things back through childhood. There's something about the DNA profile of certain people that's of interest not only to these ETs in a multi-generational abduction hybridization sense, but also to the deep black elements of the military and medical community that are deeply involved in this as well. So that basically was how I came to be. Long story short, I met Barbara Bartley in the process, and because by that point I'd realized that the reptilians were major players in this. Not saying they're at the top of the heap, but they're up there. The reptilians, the Manus beings, and others like them. And I started networking over the phone with Barbara almost on a daily basis, and she bestowed upon me up to that point 30 years of alien abduction experience. Now, back in those days, the reptilians were a taboo topic. I mean, Bud Hopkins would say dismissively, "Oh, lizard people." Go talk to Barbara Bartholick about that, right?
Yeah.
Whitley Strieber made this dismissive comment in his long-awaited return, to Southern California. I drove through 4 hours of Southern California traffic from San Diego to go there. And then he makes these dismissive comments about reptilians on the stage, right? So, despite all that, I knew there was something to it because I'd networked with enough people by then who'd had reptilian experiences. I'd done my field investigations in the high desert of Southern California, just teeming with reptilian activity. And then miraculously, from a karmic sense, I got reunited with Barbara Bartholick, and then, you know, everything just kind of, went from there. So, yeah, I'll pause now.
It's a lot to unpack. Was John Mack dismissive of the reptilian experience?
What I've been told by Paul Ponsat, who I've had on my show, is an outstanding French researcher, French British. That's why he speaks such good English. He told me, and I wasn't aware of this until he was on my show a few months back. He said that John Mack got bumped off after he started delving into the reptilian aspect.
That's why I
Because if
asked
you're
the
familiar
question.
with,
Yeah.
yeah, because if you're familiar with his story, he got run over by somebody and essentially murdered. A very common hit that they use on people, right? But it turns out that he was starting to delve into the reptilian aspect. Now, prior to that, now I respected him from the fact that he was a Harvard psychologist. He's out on a limb. He's doing all this work. He's worked with the kids that were in South Africa that had that a daylight encounter at the school, right? But I didn't like his take on it. That there were all the ETs were friendly, pretty much, and he even made the quote that we human beings are like a cancer, like a virus upon the universe. I said, wait a minute, we've never been allowed to fully develop our own potential, unmolested, unhindered. We've always been under some kind of cosmic vassalage. So, cut us some slack, us humans. We're still finding our feet here, right?
Yeah.
So I respected him for some of the work he's done. In some of his research, the reptilians did come up, right?
Yeah.
But he had a very, I would say, Pollyanna outlook on it, and then he gets bumped off. Well, I was thinking at the time, well, yeah, I could see why. Not saying it's right, but he was a Harvard psychologist. The whole psychology board was against him. He was out on a limb, so kudos for that. But then he gets bumped off, and then it wasn't until Paul Ponsat told me a few months ago, yes, because he was delving into the reptilian thing. And Paul
Interesting.
also told me that a French colleague of his, another French researcher, got bumped off in the not too distant past because he was delving into the reptilian aspect also. If one really studied this, they cannot help but see the reptilian insectoid mantis influence. They cannot. And the problem of some of these big name researchers, David Hopkins, David Jacobs, Bud Hopkins, what have you, they had us focus strictly on the grays and their hybridization process. I went to a David Jacobs lecture. He said there's only two kinds of beings, grays and hybrid variants between the grays and us, right? And all points in between. And there are no other beings. I thought that was nonsense because I'd spoken to people who'd been regressed by David Jacobs, and they told him about their reptilian experiences. They told him about their military experiences. He was dismissive of that, right? Now, this is something that people don't want to hear because a lot of people will point to David Jacobs. Oh, yeah, he's one of us. He's a stalwart of the human race. He's talking about the threat and the eventual planting of humanity by these hybrids, right? Yes, but he doesn't want to go in the direction of reptilians in the military either. Okay. I'm not saying he's a gatekeeper, but I would suggest that a lot of people in our field have limitations for whatever reason, dogmatic, religious, spiritual beliefs. And if you ask me, the New Age con is as bad as dogmatic, literal Bible fundamentalists, right?
Yeah.
They're two sides of the same coin, really. So, I'm just, putting this out that, yes, I respected them for the work. Bud Hopkins' books, Missing Time and Intruders, made a deep impression on me when I was in that journey cleaning out B. Dalton's bookstore, of their alien abduction books, right? So I give them credit where credit is due, but they have their limitations for whatever reason. I'm not going to, come up with motivations behind that. Right? That's up to them to figure out, right? So I'll just say that when I realized that the reptilians are major players, that's where my research was headed. And then I get to know Barbara Bartley, who'd been studying the reptilians for 30 years by that point, and essentially, in her own words, warred with the reptilians because of all the spiritual reprisals that they meted out to her, all the attacks on her family, and just what they did to her prior to bumping her off. That would be a book in itself. So anyhow, whatever you want to add.
So you came to this at first through curiosity and kind of like how I Bermuda Triangle, Chariots of the Gods, Psychic Secrets Behind the Iron Curtain, all that
Read
stuff.
all those books, yeah.
Right. So, but then you became an experiencer, and that took it to a whole nother level for you. And it's like that's when it became personal. Did your brother have similar experiences?
Very good question. When I was younger, especially in my high school years, this has been like late 70s, early 80s, he's featured in a number of dreams of mine, right? Well, not lately, but after I moved to San Diego for years, I still had dreams of that house in San Jose, in North San Jose, about a mile away from the Milpitas border. And a lot of my UFO related, ET related dreams and experiences happened right there in North San Jose. And my brother figured in a number of those dreams. In one dream, he and I were in the house alone, and there were these low flying UFOs. It was at night. There was a skylight in the addition of our family. It became a family room. And we had a typical, ranch style house, L-shaped ranch style house. And then my family had an addition built in the back, what was the backyard. So, and I had an annex. I had my own, bedroom back there. In this dream, he and I were in this, newly built annex with this, and there's a skylight above it. And we're huddling in terror because we can see in the skylight above these low flying illuminated craft flying back and forth. And we're terrified, right? It's like we're in a siege situation. That was one dream. And another dream, sometimes this happens, and some of your viewers and listeners who have had alien experiences can attest to this, that sometimes you go back to these dreams from an old household where you had a lot of these experiences. That was the case for me in San Jose. But in this case, the house in the dream was strangely bereft of furniture. There was no furniture, okay? But it was still the same house in San Jose. And it was right there in front of a busy avenue. And in the dream, he and I are looking out the front windows. And we see a gleaming silver saucer parked right in the middle of this busy avenue. No cars around. Well, we look at each other like, ugh, right? And then we look back outside. Now there's a big ramp that's extending down from the craft onto the pavement. Well, this is interesting. Next thing you know, three hairy hominoids, uh, yellow ochre fur hair, very long, spiky almost, right? And they were coming down the ramp, and they made from my perspective, a right turn. It was clear to me they were headed for the side gate, right? Silly me, I think, well, I have to make sure the side gate is locked. Not that it would make much difference, right? So I dash out the back sliding glass door, make a left, another left, and I'm there at the side wooden gate, trying to make sure it's locked. And then at that point, I hear this sound, presumably from these Bigfoot type creatures. Gonna sound silly and corny, but I'll tell you what it sounds like. It went oh yo 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 yo. It's super loud volume, like ripping the sky, reverberating in my chest. Oh yo yo yo. It terrified me, right? Years later, I'm talking to Sasquatch researchers. They said, yeah, some of them actually sound like that, right? Now, what I didn't realize at the time, this would have been 74, 75 time frame. There was a big UFO ET slash Sasquatch lap going on in Pennsylvania and in Ohio at that time, right? I've had Stan Gordon on the show, who's the expert on the Bigfoot UFO connection, especially as it pertains to that particular wave, 73, 74, 75 time frame. I've had him on the show and he talked about the experiences people have seen, Sasquatch in the vicinity of a low-flying craft or alighting from a craft or getting on board a craft, right? That happened right there around that time. So yes, my brother has figured in my experiences. And also when I briefly alluded to that experience with the TV, this is after I come back from Germany. You remember in the old days, kids today wouldn't relate, but the TV programming would sign off after a certain period of time, right? You would get the color bars, you would get the U.S. flag, and you would get the Star Spangled Banner or whatever the song was. And then after a while, it would just turn into snow. Remember that?
Yeah.
So because I was still skittish, I was having a series of experiences during that time, right? I started sleeping with the lights on again. So I went to sleep with the lights on and the TV on, and with the snow on there on the screen. And what happened was, as I lay there by all outward appearances asleep, I had this split kind of vision in my mind of me in my room. I'm in the back annex, right? Like I was telling you about that addition. The rest of the family is like another part of the house. I might as well have been on another planet because we're kind of isolated, a lot of rooms in between, right? So I'm there on my own, which I liked. I like the privacy, right? But in this instance, in this vision I was getting, there was this gray being looking out through the snow on the TV, and it was literally zapping me in my brain.
Mm-hmm.
I could feel it zapping my brain.
Wow.
Now, a lot of abductees will tell you, and a lot of them aren't even aware of this tendency, but a lot of us tend to sleep if we have an option to sleep with our bed up against a wall because subconsciously we have this, well, at least I'm guarding one of my flanks, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't work because they come through walls. So I've got my bed up against this wall. In the split screen image, in my mind's eye, there's the gray zapping my brain with some kind of electric jolt. And in the other half of the screen, it wasn't really a split screen. It was just somehow I was able to see both at the same time. In the other half, my brother was in his bedroom, clearly the other side of the house, looking at his TV screen with the same entity looking out at him. Yeah.
Wow.
And this is what happened. In order to test his reality, my brother punched his dresser. Bang. To me, it sounded as if he punched my wall that I'm laying up against. Bang. So I jolted awake. I looked over at the TV. There was just snow there. Okay. Weird, right? The next morning, I go out to the living room. My younger brother is sitting there on the sofa glaring at me, right? Really mad, right? I go in there, I do my thing, come back. Later on, I come back out to the kitchen again, still glaring at me. So finally I asked him, what's up? Why the hostility, right? Out of him comes a story. He takes me to his bedroom, shows me the dent on his dresser. This is where I punched the dresser to make sure I wasn't dreaming, right? And because I saw this thing looking at me through the TV, but somehow, for whatever reason, he blamed me for that experience, hence his dirty looks. He was glaring at me as if it was somehow my fault, right? But it wasn't my fault. I didn't
Right.
tell him about my experience. But when he showed me the dent, okay, that made the thing even more real. So also my younger brother in San Diego. This is when my dad was stationed in San Diego for a while. One night rather, he was running around the house hysterical. Now, when he was younger, when we were in Texas, he he had to have all the lights on. Okay. So even if a light was turned off a distant part of the house, he'd go over there, turn it on. Of course, it drove my dad crazy, right? Waste of resources, all that. Uh, so like whenever anyone would turn off a light anywhere in the house, he would start crying and getting hysterical. So that's a little background. Fast forward, we're in San Diego. He's running around the house hysterical. And all I can get out of him after a while was Snake Man, Snake Man. Yeah. So he must have had an encounter with what we now regard as reptilians way back then. So point being is that he definitely has had experiences. My youngest brother has also mentioned that he's had experiences as well. So it's a classic example of the ET interest, probably more than one group in a particular bloodline. I'm just one of many. My bloodline goes back to ancient China. It also goes back to Iberian Peninsula, Spanish, Portuguese, also a lot of Filipino in the middle. Okay, so it's an interesting mixture there. But there's no doubt in my mind that because I had that bloodline and because my dad was in the Navy, hence controllers had access to all my blood work, all my medical records, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, I got plugged into that covert medical experimentation thing, which later down the track, decades later, when I'm an active field investigator, I start having these my lab abductions and group my lab abductions. Some of my fellow researchers, colleagues, were being taken as a group and being trained and manipulated by the military. In this case, it was an aspect of naval intelligence in the high desert of Southern California.
Wow. So are you an RH negative person?
No, I'm not. I have a very common blood type, but there
So,
must be something about it that, is of interest. Not that I'm
right,
anything special or anything, but
right. Yeah. Interesting. Um, we know that some of this stuff, at least what I've read, seems to be generational. Have you shared this with your parents? Have they shared similar stories? What's that? What has that been like?
well, what's interesting is my dad, he's passed away, but very taciturn man. He never said much to anybody. And deeply troubled and traumatized by what he'd gone through in Vietnam as well. But when I would sit, next to him as a boy, and I would have these books about demonology and the history of all these different deities and demonic entities that have been worshipped, identified, whatever, over the millennia, right? I'm showing him all these pictures, and at one point, I showed him a picture of what we would call like a creature from the Black Lagoon type, some kind of aquatic
Yeah. Yeah.
marine kind of creature, which they do exist.
Yeah.
And he says, just quite casually, oh yeah, they have those in the Philippines, right? Now, what's interesting, monster hunters going back, centuries will talk about some of the cryptids in the Philippines, and some of them are quite uh, frightening, right? And they talk about the aswang, which is some kind of a vampire flying creature, et cetera, et cetera. Uh, so when I showed these pictures to my dad, right, he was nonplussed. Oh yeah, we have those in the Philippines, and my mom was I don't know it so much now, but very much a Roman Catholic, right? So she looked at things from a kind of a Roman Catholic perspective, and in the Filipino Roman Catholic uh, scheme of things, because it's a mixture of traditional folklore, what have you, she was very much a believer in monsters and unusual creatures. So when I started having these experiences, I couldn't help but talk about them, right? To the point
Sure.
where my friends in San Jose would just laugh at me whenever I brought the subject up. So uh, they were not resistant to it, but she thought that it could hinder me in some way socially, as far as employment purposes, whatever the case may be, she felt that I shouldn't go around talking about this, which is a joke because now I'm like a podcaster, right?
Right.
But they were quite open to it. We're not negative about it. But what happened was later, I'd moved to San Diego, like I said, and the Heaven's Gate cult happened, right? That
Yep.
mass question, was it really a mass suicide or were they taken out because of things they found out? Right? Because they were all, what Barbara Bartlett told me, but people don't know. Barbara knew uh, Bo and Pete before most people did. She'd spent like a month with them at their place in some other part of the country, and she attested to the fact that all kinds of strange phenomena occurred around Maurice Applewhite, whatever his name was. Sudden cyclones, sudden tornadoes, and there was just a lot of phenomena. Now, big shot, big time researchers later, after the Heaven's Gate mass suicide, so called, they were dismissive of them. Oh, well, these people, these are the ones that give us serious researchers a bad name. Yeah, wait a minute. Why was Barbara Bartlett telling me years ago before any of you guys heard of that
Well,
these
yeah,
people were into some weird phenomena, right?
right. I mean, they chased the phenomena. Like they were on
That's not a good idea.
they were on the hunt for it. And they were down in Rancho Santa Fe. And
Yeah.
yeah, and the thing that always struck me about that event that really got kind of swept under the rug was the fact that I think wasn't it Comet Elenin? Wasn't it
Yes.
and there was supposed to be this companion to Elenin and Courtney Brown, who I used to have on my show on a semi-regular basis, was talking about this companion through a remote viewing that was happening, I guess, through what was it, Farsight? That was his thing, was the Farsight Institute. And at that time, I think Art Bell was probably at his apex, right? So
Yes.
Courtney Brown was on Art Bell, and he had his buddy on there, the other remote viewer, Ed Dames, right?
James. Yeah.
Yeah. So Courtney Brown is talking about this companion to Elenin, and they're like in lockstep with him. Like they're allowing him to disseminate this information. And that's when the Heaven's Gate cult or group either commits mass suicide or is taken out. It's right at that time. And then Art Bell and Ed Dames flipped the table on Courtney Brown and basically said that they were baiting him because they had information from an observatory in Hawaii that was contrary to that there was no companion to Elenin, and that they were just allowing him to do that so that they could debunk him. And I always thought that was like really fucking weird. Yeah. Like why would they encourage him to talk about this thing? Was there indeed a companion to Elenin? And obviously Courtney survived it because he was able to continue to do his work, but he took a major hit during that whole thing. It just seemed completely bizarre, and that somehow that was tied to what happened to this group of people in Rancho Santa Fe. What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, people should know Rancho Santa Fe is an extremely exclusive community. I mean, we're talking multi-million-dollar houses. Yeah. Interesting addendum, not many people know. I'll share it right now. My friend Rob Baldwin, who became the successor to Sean Atlanti at the UFO Society, San Diego UFO Society, told me that he'd spoken to a neighbor of the Heaven's Gate cult there in Rancho Santa Fe. He said the night after, like a night or two after the mass suicide and the police were there and everything, he said that there was a saucer hovering above that home in Rancho Santa Fe, beaming a light down into the home. This is after the deaths, after the bodies have been removed, right? So there's a weird kind of, denouement as far as what happened after that, which again lends credence to there's weird ET connection. Now, tracking back to my mom, okay, She called me up when the Heaven's Gate story breaks because she thought I was in the cult, right?
She, your, your poor mother.
Yeah, yeah. She calls up James. She's leaving me all these the old cassette voicemail days, be really long messages, right?
Yeah.
So I'm playing them, and like every one of my mom frantically, and my sister calling me, and frantically calling me, and other
Oh my
people calling me.
God.
Right? It's like,
Oh yeah.
oh, James, UFOs, San Diego, Heaven's Cult, mass suicide. Oh, he must be involved. He must be dead, right?
Right.
So
Right.
I have to call my mom. No, I'm still here. She's going, please don't talk about UFOs anymore. It's bad. Don't talk about aliens, right? So, okay, mom, okay, calm down, all right? So anyway, back to the Heaven's Gate. What Barbara also told me was people don't know, but a lot of people don't know, but a lot of the members of the Heaven's Gate cult were world-class computer scientists.
They were
These people,
very heavy duty people.
yes, they were
Yeah.
getting contracts from probably, in all likelihood, government contractors. And as you know, right, there in San Diego, you got SAIC, you got all these other major intel-related corporations right there in San Diego. So Barbara and I speculated that what if they somehow came across some information or they were tasked with something, they completed their task, and then decided to wipe the slate clean and just get rid of them and call it a mass suicide. When you talk about Ellen and the companion and all that, it brings it all back to me because one necessarily followed the other. You had let's face it, there was a certain degree of hysteria that came about as a result of Courtney Brown and Ed Dames coming on Art Bell to the point that when Art Bell had Whitley Strieber back, I think it was on the Coast to Coast show, Strieber said, well, if there's really something to this, you know, comet companion,
Yeah.
said, I will take it upon myself, in so many words, to be the spokesman for the entire planet, to the beings in this companionship, right?
Right.
I mean, he really said that, right? I
Yeah.
kid you not.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And the thing about it was you have all these armchair experts showing up saying, well, we're a legitimate UFO researcher. They were not really researchers. They were cranks. They discrediting people like us. Not so fast, pal. There's a lot more going on here.
Well, I think the idea that they were working on something and then whatever they did for the government and that was it. They were theoretically extracted, right? Like they got cleaned up. That makes a lot of sense,
It
actually.
was like wiping the slate clean. Not
Yeah.
saying it was any relation, but around the same time frame, give or take. You had Danny Casolaro, the Octopus, Promise Software, Inslaw, all that was going on, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying there was a connection, but when one starts delving into the deep black computer, information sharing world, and my friend William Pollock, Bill Pollock, he was assassinated. He was one of those guys, a consultant contractor with all these three-letter agencies, deeply involved in computer information sharing work. He gets bumped off, right? So point being is that when someone starts delving into that deeply, they can. This is why they hate Gary McKinnon so much, right?
Yeah.
And to give you give the listeners and viewers an idea of what compartmentalization is all about, despite all the access Ed Snowden had as a systems administrator, best he can come up with UFO wise were confidential level messages. He never got the secret, never got TS, never got above top secret compartmentalized SCI type information. The best he can come up with, a systems administrator, was confidential. So that tells you. And if you read the book by Ben Rich, he talks about the development of the F-117 stealth. He talks about how they made arrangements with NSA to create a standalone communication system between Fort Meade and the Skunk Works in Burbank, and also related facilities in Palmdale and Groom Lake, et cetera, et cetera. It was a standalone comms network that people like Ed Snowden would not have had access to. So when you hear people blowing smoke, I had a top secret, above top secret clearance, I didn't see anything UFO related. Well, sorry, pal, you were part of the club. Okay? You were out of the loop.
Yeah. For people that don't know, Ben Rich was the head of Lockheed Skunk Works, the most elite of Lockheed's researchers. And rumor has it, on his deathbed, he spilled the beans. And he said basically that not only can we go to the stars, we're already there, we've been there. We have free energy, and it would take the hand of God to wrest it from us and give it to the public. And then he also, you can maybe clarify this one for me, James, that how they got there was basically solving the kind of Einsteinian equation and being able to basically fold time and space. And that's pretty much how they were able to get there. Am I right?
Well, he did say something which I thought was interesting. He said that there was something wrong with the equations, and I can only infer, I'm guessing here, that he referred to Einstein's general theory of relativity. He
Right.
said there was something wrong with the equations. We made those corrections, and now the military can travel to stars. We can take ET home. And the deathbed confession, one of them, to Tom Keller, he was with MUFON, an aerospace consultant, and he interviewed Ben before he died, and they had this discussion
Yeah.
about the technology, and it also came up in discussion, which I thought was interesting, that extra sensory perception was involved too, because Kelleher asked Ben Rich, well, how do they navigate these craft, right?
Yeah.
The ETs, and he answered the question with a question of his own. He goes, well, tell me, how does ESP work? All time and space is one. He goes, exactly, that's how it works. All time and space is one. And so we're talking about a guy who was the late director of Lockheed Skunk Works. He cannot be dismissed out of hand. And also, as far back as 1980 in Los Angeles, he gave a public presentation to engineers and aerospace consultants in, I think, UCLA somewhere, where he, at the end of the presentation, he made this cryptic comment about how, they can now take ET back home, right? And then, of course, this sparked interest. Why
Yeah.
wouldn't it? So all these people gathered around him after the lecture and were plying him with questions, because that's what real researchers, real people with curiosity do. And I'm glad you brought this up, because we have to look at how we got to the slippery slope, how it bottomed out the way it did. Because you're talking about there was a crash retrieval, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, April 1941, memory serves. You had the Battle of Los Angeles, February 18th, 1942, if memory serves, where a number of large craft were illuminated by spotlights. There was a lot of war hysteria going on. There were, a Japanese submarine had recently surfaced and shelled oil fields there in California at one point. So there was a lot of skittishness to the point where they evicted all the Japanese Americans. What a shameful thing that was. So suddenly one night, all these large craft slowly go flying over Los Angeles, and they open up with thousands of rounds of anti-aircraft rounds. Some people actually got killed from the falling debris, and some people had a heart attack, right? And then in some of the classified messages that ensued, that wound up in the Majestic documents, so-called, and I have no reason to doubt at least some of them are valid. They talk about how these were not Japanese planes. They were not any kind of normal craft. There was something else, right? And they even found some parts of wreckage or whatever that had been shot off. So that's just a little background story. And then you get to the period of time before Roswell, where there were actually crash retrievals leading up to Roswell. It wasn't the only one. The much disputed, I have no reason to doubt the authenticity of the alien autopsy film. There was deliberate obfuscation from people to make it seem as if that came from Roswell. It did not. It actually came from May 1947, a full 2 months before Roswell. It was a different crash retrieval, and the film was taken of a different set of ETs. But they try to, throw some, muddy the waters and say, oh, that's Roswell, and that create a whole life of its own. It wasn't. Then Roswell happened. Now, what was different about Roswell was Roswell represented a bonanza of material, exotic material, because the craft blew up in the air, showered a debris field with all kinds of goodies, let's say, out of which came microcircuitry, fiber optics, metametals that we're now calling metametals. Fast forward to Terminator 2, when Arnie comes back as a good, cyborg, and he is there to combat the bad cyborg, who was played by Patrick somebody or other. He wound up in the X-Files later on. But if you remember the movie, that bad cyborg who took over a policeman as a host, he had this memory, metallic alloy, water alloy kind of aspect to him. No matter how you sliced and diced him, he regenerated and came together. And there was scenes where he would um, like just morph into like a pool of metallic water and then slide underneath these prison bars, get to the other side when he was trying to go after Sarah Connor. Point being is that Donald Schmidt mentioned on my show the Roswell witnesses, and they simply waited for the Roswell witnesses to die out. And so there's no need to subpoena them to Congress, of course. So what Donald was told by some of the eyewitnesses who held the material, he said this alloy or whatever it was would like flow between the fingertips like water.
Wow.
Then when you would put it back on a flat surface, it would flatten out again. Or you can crumple it up into a ball, open the palm of your hand, it would flatten out. And Frankie Rowe, one of the witnesses who was threatened by the military, she was a young girl at the time. She said when you held it, it was like water, like it was like you were holding nothing in your hand, right? So when you delve into some of those majestic documents, it talks about how the microcircuitry, what we now know as microcircuitry from the Roswell crash, was studied at MIT. That they were active. It was suggested that they should have biological warfare programs based on the alien cadavers that were recovered. There are parts of the majestic documents from the field reports that talk about how these SEDs, special engineering detachments from Armed Forces Special Weapons Project at Sandia, how some of them had died there on site. They were even wearing hazmat suits. It didn't matter. It was either exposure to something from the craft, the interior of the craft, but also from close contact with the alien cadavers. And we saw this in the Varginha UFO incident in Brazil, where these two ETs got loose in the city of Varginha. The military came around. This one military guy, his name escapes me at the moment, he jumped out of the car. He wrapped his bare hands around the little ET, hauled it back to the vehicle, and they took it away, right? That guy wound up dying of a horrific superbacterial infection within a day or two, right?
Wow.
And now there's this big schism once again. Germs aren't real, pathogens aren't real. They're just like overexcited exosomes. It's so easy to manipulate and fool these people into thinking that everything's a hoax and something is not real, right? So point being is that Roswell represented a bonanza of all these different technologies, which they otherwise would not have been able to get to. Some of these crafts, Robert, they can't even get into. The recovery in December 9th, 1965 at Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, outside of Pittsburgh, some of Leonard Stringfield's sources were telling him, they tried to get into this thing. They were using acetylene torches. They were using diamond tip drills. They couldn't get in. So some of these craft they can't even get into. They just store them somewhere, right? But Roswell was different. They had all these components they can work with. And my belief is, this is just a working hypothesis, that this is where they integrated. There's always been this sub rosa astronomer priesthood, for lack of a better term, that always existed, since the last series of cyclically driven cataclysms kind of wiped the slate clean on the surface. Survivors, and then you have the priesthood take over, wiping out all the shamanic traditions, and then you have this astronomer hybrid priesthood. Well, that priesthood had been there all along. So there's no doubt in my mind that at the time of Roswell and the crashes prior to it and after it, there was that element, that warlock adept black magic element within the military industrial complex. It's finally happened. We have it now. So let's proceed from here. So there were survivors from the Roswell crash. Some of them were taken to a special habitat at Los Alamos. Others were taken to Wright Pat. And we have to look also at what happened to the Manhattan Project. I just saw the Oppenheimer movie. They could have chopped off 40 minutes from that. But you had Dr. Gordon Gray, who was the head of the security clearance hearing for Oppenheimer. What people don't realize is Gordon Gray was the original MJ-12er. He created, at the behest of MJ-12, the Psychological Strategy Board, which was the highest level agency, super secret, that dealt with creating psychological warfare operations against the American public. And it was created specifically to deal with the enormity of the whole alien presence here on Earth, right? You had people like C.D. Jackson, who was also an editor for Time Life, a magazine that was part of the Psychological Strategy Board. So they created a whole apparatus to not only provide a secure means of protecting this information, but also a whole apparatus designed to mislead the public. Okay, so we have the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, which is an outgrowth of the Manhattan Project, the military side. The civilian side was the Atomic Energy Commission, and then the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project at Sandia went through a number of name changes. The Defense Nuclear Agency, AEC, became the Department of Energy. Then you fast forward to the 70s. Then you have stories like Thomas Costello. He was the RAND specialist, escaped from Dulce. He said it was a Department of Energy facility. He said he was a RAND security specialist. His job was audiovisual security, right? His story really smacks of truth. Not only that, though, but Barbara Bartley had regressed. Krista Tilton, one of the first witnesses who was taken inside Dulce, had seen aliens working with cows that are extracting blood from it. And then I recently had Ted Rice on my show. He was likewise a friend and protege of Barbie's. He was intimidated. He told me the backstory. I was getting some of the backstory from Barbie. She was mentioning to me cryptically, she was working with Ted Rice again, was the subject of the book Masquerade of Angels that Dr. Carla Kerner wrote with Barbara. They were working again. Barbara got threatened. She backed out. Ted Rice was threatened. He backed out. And then Barbara wanted to say to the Ted, okay, look, let's get back into this. We'll be very covert about it. Didn't work out that way. Barbara was killed. And then when I had Ted on my show in the recent past, he told me that he likewise, because through a certain sequence of events, he wound up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, of all places. He could see the Kirtland Sandia complex from his house, Kirtland Air Force Base. He was taken by an ET craft, flew over the military base, landed, and he could see, looking out one of the portals, he could see like military facilities, trucks, jeeps, what have you. And then they went into an underground facility where he saw mantis beings devouring human children. Okay, so we went from a slippery slope of recovered craft interacting with the few survivors of these craft. Somehow or other, we get to the stage where there's a full-blown treaty. And I've had Paul Blake Smith on my show talking about the Eisenhower aspect of the treaty, talking about Nixon's understanding and Jackie Gleason's knowledge of all this, of all people. So it's a slippery slope because there in the Archuleta Mesa in New Mexico, there's an underground base. Phil Schneider was that engineer. You probably heard of him. He was building tunnel systems there in Archuleta Mesa. They came across an alien habitat underground. Big shootout ensued. He almost got killed, right? Archuleta Mesa is a stone's throw from the Sandia base, Manzano weapons storage area. Paul Benowitz was one of the great old school UFO researchers. They went out of their way to literally drive him crazy, throw him into a loony bin, shoot him up full of Thorazine, electroconvulsive shock therapy, the whole 9 yards. In his naivete, dangerously naive, Paul took his findings to the Air Force at Kirtland Air Force Base. He'd recorded what he thought were alien communications. He had lots of video footage of ETs, of craft rather, and including craft flying in and around Manzano weapons storage facility there at Sandia. Because the way it works is the Atomic Energy Commission, they have their scientists and techno geeks. They develop the nuclear weapons. Then they pass custody to the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project in Sandia, what they call the Kirtland Sandia complex. And then from there, they disperse the nuclear ordnance to the various weapons depots to make it easier for Strategic Air Command and these other nuclear bomb-wielding agencies to be able to access the weapons. So they get developed by the AEC, later the Department of Energy, transfer custody of the completed weapons to the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project. One of the repositories is Manzano weapons storage area in Sandia, and many people have seen craft fly in and out of there, right? So here's Ted Rice years later, what time frame, but he's taken underground beneath Dulce, what he thought was Dulce, where he saw these mantis beings. Now, while I still have time, and it's going to go into some pretty dark areas, okay, we have to go, or I have to go anyway, where the information leads us, no matter how unpalatable it is, no matter how confronting and troubling it is. My attitude is, from a strictly personal viewpoint, is I have to learn everything about this subject. It's either that or my ass, because I'm the one. I'm in the crosshair. They mucked with me before, these ETs and these deep black elements of the military, and they might do it again. So it behooves me to learn everything I can, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So somewhere along the line, we have this treaty develop, and then fast forward to the 70s, 80s, and the present day, we have humans and non-humans working in unison in these underground bases. We've identified a lot of them. I did a lot of field investigations in Victorville, Apple Valley area of the Southern California high desert. There's an underground base there. Myself and some of my colleagues were taken to against our will by the military, and there are reptilians there. Okay, and this is completely unconstitutional. They can't be having these kinds of alliances without letting us know about it, but they have. And it seems to me it's becoming more clear by the day that they're in league. At least some of the ETs are in league with are the wrong ETs to be in league with. Because what Roswell did was, Philip Corso talks about this, and he wasn't the only one, I'm sure. They seeded that technology into the R&D think tanks, the universities, into the military industrial complex without telling them the source. Here it is, make it of it what you will, take patents on it, make a pile of money, we don't care, right? And so fast forward today, is it a coincidence? Is there a causal connection? People are walking around addicted to this. Paul Ponson points out that when Edmund Kelly and Dr. John Dee were doing their scrying, right, and talking to the angels of the Watchtower about the future world government, Edmund Kelly was looking into a black cloth, i.e., a black screen,
Right.
and he said that Paul Ponson pointed out that the initial motivation behind the creation of television was to commune with these other spirits, other entities. Tesla talked about that too, how he's some kind of telepathic communication with beings from Mars, right?
Right.
So here, fast forward, everyone's got their nose, no situational awareness, walking down busy streets, right? How did that happen, right? I would suggest that technology from Roswell and other crashes has been seeded into the military industrial complex, and then they used it to create this digital panopticon type of control grid we have now. And then to the darker aspect, and I'm so gratified that David Politis has come out with Missing 411, the UFO connection, because Barbara Bartley, Eve Lorgan, and I, Dr. Carlos Turner, have been talking about this for years. The underground processing plants where humans, all ages, are taken and they are used essentially as a food source. The fluids are extracted from them. There's a variety of different beings involved: greys, insectoids, reptilians, Draco. Human military have been seen at some of these facilities as security, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about human security, could be under mind control, may not be, are guarding these facilities while these mass atrocities are taking place against the human race. And I would argue that when you hear people like Alice Jones say there's no proof of Roswell, no proof of recovered alien craft, no proof of alien bodies, that's all nonsense. The information was always there. But like I said earlier, people have their limitations. For whatever reason, I'm not ascribing a motive. You look at people like Linda Howe. I give her all the credit in the world for coming up with the cattle mutilation research. She really set the bar for that. Allowed other people to, take up the mantle as well. But she balks at and is absolutely vehement that human mutilations does not happen. Human mutilations do happen because some of the same features you see in the cattle mutilations, a part of the lips taken off, part of the ear missing, the left ear, the rectum's cored out, the major organs taken out, etc. You see the same thing replicated in these human mutilation cases, right? And
Yeah.
even if there was only one human mutilation case, we would have a problem. But there's way more than that. There have been instances when whole communities have disappeared. Okay, a whole battalion in World War I disappeared, fighting against the Turks. So we're talking about mass abductions, but in this case, they don't return the people; they just disappear. There's a number of fighter pilots that have disappeared over the years, right? Felix Monclaw over Lake Superior. Him and his backseater were vectored to intercept a UFO in the lake. The two blips merged, gone, disappeared. Just one example of many. airline pilots, military pilots have been reporting these things long before these Tic Tac videos come out. Richard Haynes has done a voluminous amount of airline, almost tedious. And when you read account after account after account, point being is that he's amassed cases as far back as 1916, First World War era of pilots reporting unidentified flying objects. So this notion that this all came about because of the Tic Tac videos and the fighter pilots, that's nonsense. It's been with us all along. And so my studies, my research takes me to where the information goes. And if it takes us into dark areas of some of my guests, David Eckhart, has been in these reptilian layers underground in Florida, where he's seen humans held in captivity, where he's seen humans being processed. And that's the whole Dulce story. Why Thomas Costello escaped, because he couldn't take it anymore. There was a rebellion among some of the security personnel at Dulce that they didn't like what was going on. This is the 1970s. This is already happening. A slippery slope. Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, Atomic Energy Commission. Fast forward, underground vats with human body parts, conveyor belts with human body parts coming out of it. This is what Carla Turner and Barbara Bartley come up with. In their research, and I've since independently confirmed that, as has Evie Lorgan and others. It's happening. So that's something that we have to contend with, that the fact that the human race is a food source for these beings. We are not at the top of the heap, okay? And like I said, I'll let you run with this after this, but a lot of people are going to rebel at the notion of this. No, we're at the top of the heap. And there's almost a flat earth, the sun revolves around the moon aspect to this. This is why Alex Jones has such influence, because he's a Christian Zionist. A lot of his followers are fundies, Christian fundamentalists, right? I have my own relationship with Jesus, but it's got nothing to do. It's more like a Gnostic kind of a scene mentality, is my viewpoint and understanding of who Jesus was and what he represented. It's not this twisted fundamentalist version that we have to contend with. Because what they're saying is there are no aliens, there's only demons. Because the interdimensional hypothesis was put forward by Dr. Jacques Vallée, longstanding military connections. There's pictures of him like buddying up with Anton LaVey of all people, right? And he was the one that said, no, the extraterrestrial hypothesis is nonsense. This can only be explained by the interdimensional hypothesis, which neatly sidesteps the hardware issue, which Ben Rich and others talked about, the recovered alien technology, but it also fits in neatly with the fundy mentality that there's no aliens, there's only demons and fallen angels, hence no technology. And Carla Turner told me, demons don't need to fly around in a spaceship. Demons don't need technology. Demons don't need handheld devices of technology, which people like me and others have described for decades now, that they have technology. These are not demons. Now, their behavior may be demon-like. Another thing, too, is the extraterrestrial hypothesis and an interdimensional hypothesis are not mutually exclusive. Right. Some beings have the ability to do both. Right. Bill Hamilton, one of the late great researchers, I don't know if he's passed away. Sorry, Bill, you're still on this side of the veil. But one of Bill's sources was a Marine sergeant who was involved in a crash retrieval in the early stages of American involvement in Vietnam, 1958. They recovered a craft in Southeast Asia. They put it on board the deck of the USS Oriskany aircraft carrier. My uncle, late uncle, used to be on the Oriskany. They put a tarp over it and brought it back to my dad's old stomping grounds, NES Alameda, there in San Francisco Bay. Now, Sergeant Suggs, who worked on the craft, and it's interesting the all in the family aspect, because his father was the naval intelligence officer who accompanied Eisenhower to Muroc Field, later Edwards Air Force Base, when they met aliens in 53, 54 time frame, March 54. Sergeant Suggs says within the interior of some of these craft, there's something they call a transspatial resonator. What it does is it allows the occupants in the craft to adjust the frequency, the density of the craft and all its occupants in order to easily transition into another universe entirely, another alternate reality, another dimension, if you will. So he said some of these beings are not only spacefaring, but they're also capable of interdimensional travel. Right. So the whole thing about the interdimensional being the only thing, ET H doesn't exist. That's just another red herring put forth by a guy who's a known government, in my view, um, because Valet tried to debunk Roswell. He did in his book Revelation, right? And he thinks we forgot about that. So anyhow, I've talked enough today. I'd like you to
Wow,
take out all this.
so there's a lot to unpack there. What about this idea that there are also crypto-terrestrials, that there are species that lives inside the earth, and maybe that's not exclusive to the extraterrestrials? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, that's a very good point. If you just look at the reptilians, for example, I've always said there's three types basically. There's the spacefaring type, but they also, some of them have the ability to alter the density and frequency. Remember what Tesla said, with resonance, anything is possible. So some of these reps in our example, they're spacefaring, but they have had long-standing colonies and bases on Earth, beneath the ground, beneath the oceans. So, and they've been here so long, they may as well be Earthlings when you look
Right.
at it that way.
Yeah.
Then you have the subterranean reptilians who've been here all along, predating the dinosaurs. Some of them may have evolved from the dinosaurs. Interesting. You're probably familiar with the story of Dr. Dale Russell, a NASA consultant. He postulated what would have happened if a particular dinosaur, Troodon, also known as Stenosicosaurus, if memory serves, it's an upright bipedal, opposing thumb. What happened if this dinosaur survived the cataclysm which took out the rest of the dinosaurs? And let's say it, for our purposes, lived underground. What would it look like? So they came up with a sculpture and artist rendition of what this thing looks like. And it looks quite like a modern day count of an ET or a reptilian, right? A certain type. He got vilified, he got harassed, and then he dropped out of the scene entirely. It's like, okay, I dipped my toe in it and I want nothing to do with you people. Too much harassment. Right? Think about that. And also Carl Sagan's book, Dragons of Eden, which studied the origins of human consciousness and human intelligence. Why did he call it the Dragons of Eden when he himself was an arch UFO debunker, right? And very interesting.
Yeah.
But getting back to your story, I do believe there are longstanding, advanced, lack of a better term, human civilizations living in beneath within the large cavern systems underground, and there are all kinds of what we would call cryptids that live underground, and I think that more and more of them are coming to the surface, and I think that that's part of the aerosol spraying campaign. And I've said, for some time I've had Jeff Brady on my show, and he's got all the video and the still imagery to prove this, that a great many of these chemtrail planes are not planes at all, as we understand them. When you zoom in, it's like they're not planes, they're something else. And there's other weird anomalies, like a plume-laying chemtrail will fly into a cloud bank and not come out, or
Well,
will
sometimes
fly
they're
out
not
here.
even, you'll see the chemtrails, but you won't see anything attached to the chemtrails.
Exactly. Exactly. And then or if they seem to be an airplane, and just our mind just striving to find normality and some context for what we're seeing.
Yeah.
Okay. These planes are silent. There's a regular chemtrail plume over my house, low altitude. I never hear it.
Yeah.
I worked at Naval Air Station North Island. I, lived at the final approach at Lindbergh Field, San Diego. I know what planes sound like.
Yeah.
These things are silent.
They are
And you look
silent.
at their look at their Blue Angel type maneuvers where the plumes literally intertwine like thread, right?
Yeah.
That's who's going to do that? The Blue Angels? No. Okay, that's ridiculous. So point being is that it's all about global dimming, among other things, and to make it, enable it, in my feeling, for these beings to comfortably reside on the surface again.
Well,
So
yeah.
we may be going back to a point in time in the days of yore. They talked about, and this is why it's a multidisciplinary approach. One has to study books like Celtic faith in fairy, the Celtic faith in Celtic countries by William Evans Wentz, or The Science of Fairy Tales by E.S. Hartley. Jacques Vallée and Whitley Strieber talk about these books, but it goes into the lore of the fairy faith. And nowadays, people roll their eyes, oh, fairies, they think it's something funny or humorous. No, in the old days, the term fairy, there was an element of fear when people brought up the fairies in polite company, because the fairies came around, took away women and children, right? Sometimes they didn't return them. That was the whole story of the changelings. Take away the baby, bring something back that's not quite the same, looks like it, right? So, and also the long-standing issue of these genetic hybridizations, the Nephilim mating with human women, et cetera, et cetera. It's deeply embedded in the lore, going back time, the beginning of time. So I'm satisfied that there are advanced humanoid civilizations underground. Paul Stonehill in Russia does great work on this. He talks about how Putin was taken beneath Lake Baikal, a huge lake over there, where he was taken in a submersible. I've heard of these similar submersibles that elements of naval intelligence, naval research lab have, take you deep underwater. And Putin apparently was taken to see one of these underwater civilizations beneath Lake Baikal. That's just one example. I believe that these undersea underground civilizations exist. I believe there's a lot of them. And the information that I have, one of my friends was taken in one of these submersibles by Naval Intelligence, Office of Naval Research, probably involved at some level, to advanced civilization. And she said that when she was introduced to these beings, they were wearing white gowns, they, very almost translucent because they don't see much, natural sunlight down there. He said that this disdain that came from these beings about humans, it's like, why do you keep coming down here? We got nothing but contempt for you people. You're destroying and polluting the surface of the world. Go away, right? That seemed to be the attitude, according to my friend, and it makes perfect sense to me. Why would they want to interact with the military on the surface that they're destroying the planet? Right?
Right.
And that also a military that seems to be, in my view, under the control of aliens, right? The hostile marauding aliens. And these civilizations, some of them would know that. But then you have the wide variety of cryptids of all different stripes. And as time goes on, I feel more and more, and it's already happening, more and more of these cryptids will start coming up from the surface. I believe the veils between worlds are thinning, and especially what we're doing with CERN and everything else. And if you go back to the Babylon working, you go back to the Watchtower working of Dee and Kelly, it was all about opening portals. It was all about letting things in, the old ones that H.P. Lovecraft talked about. So the notion of portals, stargates, opening and manipulating them is deeply embedded in the lore, but there's a scientific aspect to it too. Because as you know, in the old days, before the science was the Rockefeller science took over, there was an understanding that the ether was the medium of exchange, if you will.
Absolutely.
The ether physics, the ether was the means to access all points in time and space, but they changed that all around, right?
Yep.
James Maxwell Clerk, all that stuff has just been subsumed by Einstein in particular, and the offshoots of Einstein. That's why David Adair said, I thought it was very interesting. He said that he was taken to Area 51 as a young boy, where he was brought there at the express order of General Curtis LeMay, to inspect this propulsion system, which he described as being an alien propulsion system. It seemed to be alive. We've heard similar things. He said that his understanding of the deep black programs is they try to recruit people who have not been overly contaminated by the surface level education system, because they found through trial and error that when they read those people into these deep black aerospace programs, they're almost useless, because everything they have to unlearn everything, all the dogmas they've been brainwashed into believing on the surface. Now they're working on all this stuff. And Bob Lazar talked about this too, in so many words. He said it was his out of the box, out in left field way of thinking, which prompted Edward Teller to recruit him on the program. Very quick comment, getting back to the Oppenheimer movie, by getting Oppenheimer out of the way. Remember, he was the chairman of the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission, a very powerful position. If you read the report for the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit out of Roswell and other documents related to the Majestic documents, they specifically mention Oppenheimer being on site at one of the crash sites. And he was also tasked with examining what seemed to be a nuclear reactor recovered from some of the craft. Other prominently named scientists are Dr. Theodore von Karman. Hardly anyone talks about him, a Hungarian. He headed up the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board set up by General Henry Arnold, right? And so these people were deeply involved. And then when Oppenheimer moved out of the picture because they refused to give him a security clearance, this is when Teller really came to the fore, to the point where later down the track, he's recruiting Bob Lazar, people like Bill Uhouse, a aerospace engineer, former test pilot for the Marines. He was working on alien technology, working with an alien sidekick advisor at S4. And he said he saw Edward Teller at the facility. He also saw George Herbert Walker Bush at the facility too, if memory serves. So he was another one that had access. So again, there's this whole, what's been described as a breakaway civilization. It exists. all these resources from the servers are being sucked into it. We're not getting anything except oppression and more surveillance and more manipulation out of it. And what's going on with the general public now, with the mass mind control? The military abductees and the people in these various projects have been subjected to this level of mind control for a long time. I would suggest that as people like myself and my colleagues who are my labs, that we're the test subjects. We're the beta test for what's going on the surface, all the rollouts of all these different surveillance and monitoring and implant technology techniques. They did a lot of that stuff on us. So of course we have a right to be upset about this, but please, in the few minutes I got left, take it
Well,
away.
and so the one thing I kind of wanted to take, with one place I wanted to take this, is that when we look around and we see our so-called leadership and the actions that they take, or at times don't take, one can only surmise that these would be the actions of people who are not human.
That's right. And thank you for saying that, because there is an inhuman aspect to it. You look at what happens at these sordid, horrific ceremonies where, soon after engaging in a blood sacrifice, they're engaging in an orgy. Okay. So how can anyone derive any kind of sexual arousal or gratification, when there are all these mutilated dead bodies around?
Yeah.
That's inhuman.
Yeah.
And when you look at what they're doing, what they're normalizing, the LGBTQ, the WEF openly endorsing pedophilia, et cetera, that's so predatory, it's not even funny. So what they've done is, and I've studied the serial killers long before it became chic, and you see all these Netflix series about this, that, and the other serial killer, because of my studies and my understanding of the reptilian human hybridization agenda. The large body of work about serial killers, oftentimes in the words of the serial killers themselves, John Wayne Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, et cetera, that is a very good window into the mind of a reptilian Draco-human hybrid. And so if you just look at that mindset and transfer it over to the so-called elite,
Yeah.
well, is it any wonder that you hear stories of Hillary dancing around with some young child's face on her
Right.
face,
Right.
and all that stuff? It's like they're not human.
They're not human.
And the countless examples of shape shifting, which go back in time immemorial. People have been describing shape shifting from the very beginning,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So
And then
that's what we're up against. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you bring up the World Economic Forum and you bring up climate change and and the insect diet and everything that goes along with it. And I'm like, what the hell is going on here? I mean, they're terraforming this place. They're conditioning humans to taste a certain way, maybe produce a certain type of nutrient, or the whole bug diet to me is mind blowing, right? And how they're pushing this thing. And it's not because they want to humiliate people and make them eat bugs. There's something else going on here that has to do with some kind of food source and dietary component.
Yeah, because what some of the witnesses have described is in these underground bases, what the aliens do is, and I've heard this argument say, oh, it's impossible for ETs to come here, insectoids, mantis beings, to eat humans because they wouldn't have the enzymes to digest terrestrial matter. That's nonsense. That's presupposing this is the only planet in the cosmos where humanoid beings are subject to predation, when I would suggest that this kind of predation goes on all over the cosmos, all over the multiverse, probably, right? There's just this prey-predator dynamic that's been going on all along. So these beings would have been able to adapt to the food sources here. Also, the eyewitness accounts of people taken on board alien craft, seeing insectoids, seeing mantis beings, okay? So that kind of puts a kibosh on the notion that, oh, of necessity, these insectoids have to be terrestrial, have to come from beneath the earth. I'm not suggesting that no insectoids in our example come from underneath the earth. I think some do, but definitely there are some from off-world that have managed to use humans as a food source. What they do is they extract a lot of the vital fluids, they put them all in a vat, and what they do to purify it, if you will, is they combine it with hydrogen peroxide, according to some of the witnesses. And what these aliens, some of these aliens do is they stick their arms into the vats of nutrients and absorb it that way. They don't have an alimentary canal like we do, so they excrete their waste products through their skin.
Yeah.
Which explains in part why some of these entities stink. I mean, they really stink, some of these entities, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, these are just scaled up insects. A praying mantis being 7, 8 feet tall, that's just an overgrown mantis being, it happens to have technology. And another troubling aspect is they seem to be involved in the death and dying process. They seem to be involved in the reincarnation process. And they also seem to know about who we are at a soul level even before we enter into the earthly plane. If we come into this earthly plane, they know more about us than we know about ourselves. For us, we have to unpack and put all this stuff together. Who the heck are we? Why am I having these experiences? But they've been tracking us generationally by this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
So, we have to look at it from that standpoint. We are the subject of prey. And when you look at the geoengineering and the terraforming, it's clear to me. One of my favorite field of study is the giant tree syndrome. You look at all these buttes and plateaus. The finer details of plant anatomy or tree anatomy, for lack of a better term, is scale invariant. So you can look at a tree stump in someone's yard, then you look at some of these buttes and some of these plateaus, everything is there. It's replicated. It's scaled up.
Yeah.
So my question is, who came along with this kind of high-tech version of a chainsaw and saw these things off? And they're
Right.
all over the planet. All
Right.
over the planet.
The Devil's
I have a
Tower is a
theory.
giant tree.
It's a giant tree. And here's my thoughts about the matter. The root systems, we know that the root systems of regular trees can cause havoc for the sewer systems and the plumbing. We know that, right?
Mm.
So what if these root systems for these gigantic trees burrow so far into the ground, they get to the magma level, right?
Yeah.
They create all these natural lava tubes, which beings can use as for travel purposes underground. So there's a whole field of study, and they probably create gigantic cavern systems too. These root systems.
Yeah.
And so along comes an advanced technology, species say, okay, we'll just get rid of the roots, we'll shore things up. Now it's a base, right?
Yeah.
So I know it sounds silly, but think about it. When carbon dioxide and the oxygen content was so high back in the old days, paleo ancient times,
Everything was
everything
huge.
was over.
Everything's huge.
Everything was huge.
Yeah.
Everything. There is a mountain range on Earth that looks from above like the outline of a woman laying on her side.
Right. I've seen
Right.
the ones with elephants that are islands.
Elephants.
And, I mean,
Snakes.
yeah.
Everything was like oversized. So here they are, the elite saying, "Oh, carbon-based life forms like yourself, like myself, right, or us, and we're bad for the planet." It's like suddenly carbon, we're carbon-based life forms.
You got to
But
go
we're
to
the
carbon
ones in the
zero.
crosshairs.
Carbon zero.
You got to net zero.
Do the math.
You have these kids nowadays saying farming is bad. Let's get rid of it all. So if you look at the mentality too, the Marxist Luciferian ideology that they pump into these kids very early age nowadays, and they're excreted out of the college system. That's a Luciferian system. It's the mentality, they can't even tell the time on a normal clock face anymore.
Right.
A lot of these college age students. So
Yeah.
we're talking about, on the one hand, they've been dumbed down. On the other hand, they've been turned into these foaming at the mouth activists who want to shut down all forms of modern life in order to paradoxically save the planet when we're being chemtrailed and the background nuclear radiation levels are going through the roof. I mean, the whole thing is a joke.
It is a joke. Well, listen,
Anyway,
I know
I
you
gotta
got to
boogie.
go. I know
Hey,
you got to
thanks,
go.
buddy.
This has been amazing. We're going to have you back on because we need to unpack some more. Like you're just scratching the surface here. And I know you got a lot more that you want to share and can share. So let's not wait as long as we did last time. Let's get you back on again and let's have a part 2 to this conversation because I think this thing is really deep.
I'll work it out so we can find a time when I can be on for 2+ hours if that's okay.
No, we'll do that. James Bartley, Cosmic Switchboard, go there, check out the deep material, check out the interviews. You won't be disappointed. And let's support the man too. You can do that through PayPal. He's got a membership. So go there, check it out. James, thanks again.
It's a lot, buddy. And to all your viewers, greetings to you. Take it easy.
All right, we're back. Wow, quite the download. And there are things in there that you uh, may agree with, disagree with. I think that there are probably concepts that, if you remove the term alien and maybe put in the word elite, that some of these behaviors, which we covered, some of these antics that seem to be perpetrated without any sense of soul, begin to fit, right? And what James was bringing up about this towards the end there, about the whole kind of, I think he was connecting the mantids to the incarnation process and seeming to know everything about you, right? Because we all have a signature. We all have an energy signature, just like we all have a thumbprint that is completely distinct. And we all have different astrological charts, even twins. If their charts are different, even if they're um, separated by minutes, it's a different chart, just slightly by degree, but different, right? So, I was making this connection in chat about that sounding a lot like archons, that that what we would consider to be that kind of managed activity in the entrance process and the exit process, which James attributes to these mantid-like beings, sounds a lot like archons to me, and that there does seem to be some kind of harvesting and reharvesting that takes place here, and it just we're on a wheel. I mean, literally, we're on a wheel, and we go through these resets, and James was talking about the ether, and Lou B had a great comment in chat about ether being the implicate order. Wow, that was just like a next level observation, which was really, really good. And I think the fascinating thing that really strikes me about these times that we're in now is we're getting an idea as to what's gone on before, and not that long. It wasn't that long ago. We're talking, upwards of 150 to 200 years ago, right here on this continent, and then in other parts of the world, deeper places where these things that have been built, uncovered, they're just not able to be explained with the tools of the time. I'm sorry, it doesn't work. So we're in a really, I think, interesting position, as they're going to reset everything, right? We are in the great reset, just like these resets have happened before. And I think we have this unique position to be aware of it. And who knows? Maybe they were aware of it then. I maybe, but clearly, a lot of us are aware that the official story doesn't really fit, right? Clothes just don't fit. So we'll have James back on here again, and have a kind of a part two. And I think the time thing is really challenging because he's in Australia. But I'd love to do like a call-in show with James, and I'd love for people to be able to interact with him and ask him questions, because there are a lot of different opinions about the subject matter, and some people are like, it's all fake, it's all bullshit, it's all a government program, and I'm sure there's probably some of that involved, right? And some people will say, well, I think it's just interdimensional. I mean, so it'd be really good to have kind of a robust dialogue if we could have something like that, like an old time kind of Art Bell call-in show. I think it'd be really cool. We'll try to work it out. I think the maybe we'll do like an exclusive thing, or I don't do Patreon, but maybe we could do something like that. And I'll have like we do webinars here every now and then. In fact, I'm going to have one fairly soon for 11th house members on the eclipse, and that's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. But maybe we do something like that with James, and we'll just have kind of a private Q&A with James. You can dialogue with him. I think it'd be really cool. I've had some experiences with seeing things that I couldn't comprehend or didn't understand, that they just made no sense. And what was really interesting is that James was talking about this one period in the 80s, like 1988. And 1988, and even leading up to 1988, I'll tell you a story. So I used to work at this restaurant in Half Moon Bay, and I was a waiter there. And there was this waitress who worked there. I even remember her name. I'm not going to share her name, but her father was in the military, and her father, I think he had a fairly high military clearance, was very into UFOs. Her sister was, and probably still is, I would assume, a therapist, and her sister was doing kind of the Bud Hopkins, John Mack style work in the Bay Area. And so I talked to her, and I was trying to do kind of like get my feet off the ground and do, independent writing, stringer journalism, stuff like that, right? And she arranged for me to talk to her sister. So I went to San Francisco, I went to her office, and we had a really good conversation. I talked with her about her work. And then she hooked me up with two people that she had as clients who were these experiencers. And I wound up interviewing both. And this is around 1986, maybe 87. I think it might have been 87. So it's around this time that James is talking about. And so it was a guy. I've talked a little bit about this before. It was a guy and it was a gal. And the guy lived in San Francisco. He was very unusual. I actually have the cassette recording of that interview. I got to transfer it over to digital because I want to play this interview. He was a very unusual person. He was gay. I think he lived somewhere near Polk Street or something like that. And I went to his apartment to do the interview, and I walked in, and he had a mini harpsichord in the apartment, and he had built that thing. Like, how many people build mini harpsichords? I could count them on one hand. It was that guy, right? And so his gig, he had two gigs. One, he did like switchboard work, and the other was that he was a piano tuner. So, if you had a piano, he'd go into your house and tune it all up. So he had some very interesting skill sets. And I've noticed that there are a group of people who kind of look like, if you've ever, look who's here, missing in action. There he is. He spent a lot of time in the sunroom. He's got this little fuzzy crown that he occupies up in the fucking sunroom. Yeah, it's about time you showed your ass up here. We've been asking about you. Anyway, if you've ever read Marvel comic books, there's this race in the Fantastic Four called the Crawl. And they have a very kind of distinct look. They kind of look trolly. They've got kind of trolley ears. You know what I mean? And I've noticed that there are people that kind of have these features, and they're sort of craggy looking. They almost look like elementals in some ways. They're not, I wouldn't call them attractive people, by the way, not by usual standards, right? And he kind of looked like that. And then the other thing that I noticed about him is that the symmetry of his face was off. What are you doing? You come here. Come over here. And his stories were pretty remarkable. And he talked about his first encounter growing up in Central California and leaving a movie theater on a very warm night and having this light follow him. And then eventually he's abducted. And he has all these very clear abduction experiences, and very matter of fact, right? This wasn't a guy who was running around trying to seek fame or anything. And so the physiognomy and the kind of the unusual intelligence and these other things that were part of him kind of lined up. He was actually a really nice guy, and very forthright with his story. I'm going to try to convert that the video. Excuse me. And then the other person that she hooked me up with was this young woman, and she was like on the other side of the spectrum. I mean, she was, and I remember her telling me that she was an Aquarius, and she was really into Ashtar Command and all this other stuff, right? So she was like diving into her own mythology. The other guy wasn't like that. But the unusual thing about her, again with physiognomy, were her hands. And I know that shit. I'm sorry. You can't hear me. I apologize for that. Jesus, how long have I been talking? Fuck. The light went off. You missed it. I talked about crawls. I talked about hybrids. I talked about certain looks that people have with the kind of pointy ears. They almost look like elementals. You know what I'm talking about? That's what I'm talking about. Jasper, did you turn this mic off? Anyway, this guy that I interviewed kind of looked like that. And he had this kind of uneven face, or it wasn't very symmetrical. And he was very unusual, as hopefully you heard. He made his own harpsichord. He tuned pianos for a living. He told me about the first time he was abducted. He was from the Central Valley. It was a warm summer night. Left the movie theater with his friend, walked home, saw these lights. Next thing you know, he's on a craft, right? And he was not sensationalizing any of this at all. Not at all. And he talked about more and more of these experiences that he had. And then later on, he found out that it was generational. Oh, fuck. Why does this fucking happen? Why does this fucking happen? You know, I do sessions with people, and it never freezes when I do sessions with people. Let's try this. Try to reload. All right, we're back. Sorry about that. Well, I'm glad it didn't freeze up when James was talking. Anyway, my experience with somebody who was an experiencer seemed to be legit. I'm just saying, seemed to be very legit. And then the gal who I spoke with, who was a client of this woman who was a therapist, was on the other end of the spectrum. She was totally into Ashtar Command and all this shit. And I know this is somewhat common in physiognomy, but I'll never forget her hands. She had webbed fingers, and not just moderate, but like thick. Like it was almost like, you know, I don't know, like like duck's paws or something. I mean, it wasn't that extreme, but it was kind of extreme enough for me to notice. And again, she had one of these faces that kind of looked slightly put together. You know, it's almost like a Mr. Potato Head kind of face. Again, I'm not disparaging this person's looks, but it was just odd. And then I had more experiences from that period of time, not just interviewing these people, but maybe I'll get into it later. Jasper wants my attention. Jasper wants to get on the show. You turned the mic off, didn't you? It was your fault. All right, I'm out of here. Thanks for being here. Leave some comments. We'll be back on Sunday night for Sunday Night Astro Live. I want to thank James once again. Go to the Cosmic Switchboard, check out his other material, other interviews. At the very least, it's food for thought and get you to kind of think a little bit and maybe step outside the proverbial box. All right. Thanks, everybody. Mods, thank you. And again, I want to thank everybody for all of your well wishes for myself and my dearly departed mother, who I feel like is in a better place now. I've come to some place inside of myself where it's like, okay, I feel like she's moved on, and it's a positive thing. So that's where we're headed moving forward. All right. Thanks, everybody. Love you all. Take care. Have yourself a wonderful weekend. Bye for now.